Clara Brennan buried her husband Michael on February 14, 1873, on the Nebraska Territory homestead they'd claimed together just 11 months earlier, in what should have been the beginning of their life together, but became instead the brief entirety of it, a marriage measured not in decades, but in seasons. Michael died of typhoid fever at 29 years old, burning with fever that peaked at 106 degrees before his heart simply gave out, stopped beating while Clara held his hand and begged him to stay, to fight, to not leave her alone on empty prairie with nothing but unfinished dreams and unpayable debts. She'd nursed him for 12 days in the partially completed sod house they'd been living in. 12 days of watching him deteriorate from strong, healthy husband to delirious, dying stranger who didn't recognize her, who called out for his mother, who died when he was 15, who thrashed and burned and finally went still in a way that meant finished, meant over, meant Clara at 28 was a widow. They'd been married 14 months from their wedding in January 1872 to his death in February 1873. They'd claimed their homestead in April 1872, had lived in a tent that summer while starting to build their sod house, had moved into the partially completed structure in October, had planned to finish it in spring, had planned everything, had planned children, had planned prosperity, had planned a life that ended before it properly began. Clara was 28 when she became a widow. 28 with no children, no family within 800 miles, no resources beyond 160 acres of Nebraska grassland, and the partially built sod house that Michael had started but never finished. And a homestead claim that required 5 years' continuous residence in a completed dwelling, or the land reverted to the government. The law was specific, was unforgiving. Abandon the claim for more than 6 months and lose everything. Clara had until August, 6 months from Michael's death, to establish permanent legal residence in a completed dwelling that met minimum homestead requirements or forfeit everything Michael had died trying to secure. She had $73 in savings. This was everything. Michael's life insurance, a small policy he'd taken out before they married, had paid $40. She'd had $33 from her teaching wages before marriage. $73 total between her and destitution. Completing Michael's sod house would cost at least $200 in materials and labor. Building a conventional timber frame house would cost $400. She couldn't afford either. Couldn't hire workers, couldn't buy lumber, couldn't complete what Michael had started. But she could dig. And digging cost nothing except labor and time. The idea came from a conversation she'd overheard at the general store. 2 old-timers talking about the original dugout homesteads from the 1850s. Before anyone had money for lumber or even sod bricks, the very first settlers had simply excavated hillsides, lived in holes carved into earth, covered the fronts with whatever materials they could scavenge. Lived like prairie dogs, one old man had said, laughing. Dug themselves holes and called it housing. Primitive as you can get. Thank God we're past those days. But Clara heard something different. Heard free construction material. Heard naturally insulated. Heard can be built by one person alone. Heard solution. She walked her property looking for the right hillside. Found it on the south edge of her claim, a gentle slope facing south for maximum sun exposure, well-drained soil, elevated enough to avoid spring flooding. Perfect. She started digging in March, working alone, because there was no one to help and no money to hire help, even if workers existed willing to help a widow build a hole in the ground. The design was simple, but the execution was brutal. Excavate 12 feet into the hillside, creating a room 16 feet wide and 12 feet deep from front to back. The back and sides would be earth walls, natural Nebraska clay, packed and shaped and smoothed. The front would be the only exposed face, built with scavenged lumber and salvaged materials she'd find somehow. She used a shovel and pickaxe that had been Michael's, Tools that still carried the shape of his hands in worn wooden handles. Tools that felt wrong in her grip because they'd been made for a man's strength and reach. But she adapted, learned to use leverage instead of force, learned to work smarter when she couldn't work harder. The first day, she dug for 6 hours and removed maybe 12 cubic feet of earth total. At that rate, excavating the full 12 by 16 by 12 foot space would take literally months of continuous labor. She was looking at moving roughly 2,300 cubic feet of earth. At 12 cubic feet per day, that was nearly 200 days of work. She adjusted her technique. Shorter digging sessions with frequent rests, better body mechanics, started at the hillside face and worked backward, creating a sloped entry that let her wheel dirt out in a borrowed wheelbarrow instead of carrying it bucket by bucket. Progress improved to 20 cubic feet per day. Still slow, still exhausting, but possible. Her body protested constantly, 28 years old, but unused to this kind of sustained physical labor. Teaching school and managing a household required endurance, but not this type. Not the repetitive overhead swing of a pickaxe hour after hour, not the constant bending and scooping and lifting that made her lower back burn with pain by noon every day. Hands blistered within the first week, despite cloth wrapping. The blisters popped, bled, formed calluses, then new blisters formed beneath the calluses. Her shoulders developed a constant ache that didn't ease with rest. Her arms trembled at night from overuse. But the excavation grew, 3 feet deep into the hillside by the end of March, 5 feet deep by mid-April. The space was starting to take actual shape. Not just a hole, but a room, a dwelling, a solution to her impossible situation. The neighbors noticed immediately because prairie settlements were small enough that any unusual activity drew attention. Word spread through the community. The widow Brennan was digging into a hillside. Why? What was she doing? What could possibly be the purpose? When the excavation grew large enough that its purpose became undeniable, this was living space, this was intentional dwelling construction, the mockery began not gradually, but immediately, brutally, with the particular cruelty that communities direct at members who violate unspoken codes about proper behavior. Pastor David Morrison came to her property in late March, ostensibly for spiritual counseling, but really for intervention. "Mrs. Brennan, I need to speak with you about your construction project," he said, standing at the edge of her excavation, looking down at Clara covered in dirt, 12 feet into the hillside. "I'm building my cabin for the homestead requirement. You're digging a hole in the ground. That's not a cabin. That's not proper housing for a Christian woman. That's how animals live, how primitive peoples live, not how civilized Americans live." Clara climbed out of her excavation slowly, exhausted from hours of digging. "Pastor Morrison, I have $73. Completing Michael's sod house costs $200. Building a proper timber house costs $400. I have until August to establish residence, or I lose the claim. This is what I can afford to build." "Then you should accept that you cannot maintain this homestead alone. You should return to your family in Ohio. Find a husband who can provide proper housing. This isn't appropriate for a woman alone. I'm not leaving. This is my land, Michael's land. I'm staying." "By living in a hole, like an animal?" "Mrs. Brennan, people are talking, saying your grief has affected your judgment, saying you've lost perspective on proper behavior. I'm here as your pastor to tell you this path leads to ruin, physical ruin and spiritual ruin. This path leads to keeping my homestead. I'll take that over propriety." Morrison left troubled, and the next Sunday his sermon addressed the topic, without naming Clara directly: the dangers of pride, the importance of accepting one's limitations, the sin of living in ways that violated natural order and God's design for proper housing. The message was clear. Everyone knew who the sermon was about. Clara attended anyway, sat in the back, left before anyone could corner her for concerned conversations. The mockery intensified as the excavation grew. Sarah Henderson, the town's most prominent woman, organized a concerned ladies' visit in early April. "Clara, dear," Sarah began with false sweetness, standing with 5 other women at the excavation site, "we're worried about you. Living in a hole in the ground isn't healthy. The dampness, the lack of light, the impropriety of it. You'll get sick. You'll become strange from isolation. This isn't how people live. It's how thousands of people lived when Nebraska was first settled. It's how my husband and I would have lived if he hadn't gotten sick. It's practical. It's primitive. It's beneath your station. You're an educated woman from a good Ohio family. Living in a dugout is for people who have no other options. You have options. Return home, remarry, accept help. You're choosing to live like this out of stubborn pride. I'm choosing to keep my land. If that requires living in a dugout for 5 years, I'll live in a dugout for 5 years." The women left whispering, and by evening the entire community had heard. Clara Brennan was planning to live in her hole for 5 years. Not as temporary shelter while building something proper, as permanent residence. She'd fully lost her mind. Clara kept digging. By May, the excavation was complete, 12 feet deep into hillside, 16 feet wide, creating a room of roughly 200 square feet. The earth walls were solid Nebraska clay, naturally water-resistant. She smoothed them with a shovel, packed them firm, created surfaces that were rough but functional. The floor she excavated level, then covered with flat stones she'd collected from a nearby creek bed. The stones provided drainage, prevented mud, created a surface that could be swept clean. The ceiling was the hardest part. She needed to support the earth above while creating a habitable space below. She used salvaged timber beams she'd found at an abandoned homestead 5 miles away. Previous settlers who'd given up left everything behind. She hauled the beams one at a time. Using a borrowed horse and cart, she returned each evening. The beams she set across the excavation at 4-foot intervals, embedding the ends deep into the side walls. Then she laid lighter wood planks across the beams, creating a ceiling. Covered the planks with canvas she'd bought with her remaining savings. Covered the canvas with 6 inches of sod, cut in neat bricks, creating a living roof of grass that would shed water and provide insulation. The front wall was the only part visible from outside. She built it from scavenged lumber, vertical planks fitted tight, with a proper door she'd bought used for $3. A window on each side of the door, real glass in proper frames, salvaged from the same abandoned homestead as the beams. The front wall looked like a conventional cabin front, but it was the only wooden surface. Everything else was earth. She finished in early June, moved her few possessions in, slept there for the first time on June 15th. Woke up in a space that was cool despite summer heat outside, dry despite rain, quiet and still, and undeniably strange. She was living in a room carved from earth, with 3 walls of clay, 1 wall of wood, and a ceiling of sod. She was living in a hole, but she was living on her own land, in compliance with homestead law, and she'd built it entirely with her own labor. The ridicule was immediate and merciless. The name spread instantly, "The Widow's Burrow," said with cruel amusement, with pity, with judgment. "She's actually living in there," people said at church, at the store, anywhere conversation happened. "Living in a hole like a badger, sleeping in dirt, cooking in a cave. It's not natural, it's not Christian, it's not sane." Robert Henderson, Sarah's husband and the largest landowner in the area, started a petition to have Clara's homestead claim investigated, argued that a dugout didn't constitute a proper dwelling under homestead law, argued that she was violating the spirit of the Settlement Acts by building something so primitive. The land office agent came in July, a bureaucrat from Lincoln named Thomas Crawford, who'd clearly been told to expect something scandalous. He found Clara's dugout, examined it thoroughly, checked it against homestead requirements. Permanent dwelling, yes. Minimum square footage, yes. Weather-tight construction, yes. Suitable for habitation, yes. "Mrs. Brennan," he said after his inspection, "this is unconventional, very unconventional, but it meets all legal requirements. You have valid residence. Your claim stands." They said it wasn't a proper dwelling. The law doesn't define proper, just functional. This is functional. Strange, but functional. Your claim is secure. Robert Henderson was furious. The petition had failed. The widow's burrow was legal. She'd won through technicality and stubbornness, and now everyone had to accept it. But accepting legally wasn't the same as accepting socially. Clara remained isolated, mocked, excluded from community gatherings. The strange widow who lived in a hole in the ground, who'd chosen primitive living over civilized behavior. The vindication came on August 3rd, 1873, arriving with the particular violence that characterized Nebraska tornado season, arriving on a day that started deceptively normal before transforming into catastrophe. The morning had been hot and humid, temperature climbing into the mid-90s by 10 a.m. with heavy, oppressive air that made breathing feel like work, that made clothes stick to skin with sweat, that carried the particular quality of atmospheric instability that old-timers recognized as tornado weather. By noon, clouds were building in the southwest, massive dark formations that rose like mountains into the sky, towering cumulonimbus structures that climbed to 40,000 feet, that turned the horizon black, that announced severe weather with visible certainty. Clara watched them from her dugout entrance, standing in the shade of her overhang, feeling the air change. The wind shifted from south to north. The temperature dropped 5 degrees in 10 minutes. Birds went silent. The prairie grass stopped moving in that eerie stillness that precedes major storms. By 2 p.m., the clouds had turned the particular shade of green-gray that experienced plains. Residents knew meant rotation, meant funnel formation, meant tornado. The massive storm cell was maybe 20 miles away, moving northeast at the steady, inexorable pace of severe weather systems that nothing could stop or deflect. By 2:30, Clara could see the funnel. Not fully formed yet, just a dark protrusion descending from the cloud base, reaching toward ground like a finger of God, pointing at Earth, deciding what to destroy. By 2:45, the funnel touched down 8 miles southwest of her property. She watched it happen, the moment when descending cloud made contact with ground, when the rotation became complete, when tornado became reality instead of threat. Debris exploded upward from the touchdown point. Dust and dirt formed a massive column. The funnel darkened with everything it was consuming, and it was moving northeast, directly toward the settlement, directly toward her. Clara had maybe 6 minutes. 6 minutes between seeing the tornado fully form and feeling it arrive at her property. 6 minutes to decide whether her dugout would protect her or become her tomb. She ran inside, moving fast but not panicking, moving with the deliberate speed of someone who'd thought through this scenario, who'd understood when she built underground that tornadoes were the most likely test of her design. She pulled the heavy wooden door shut behind her, dropped the thick timber bar into its brackets, sealed herself inside 12 feet of earth with a tornado approaching. The dugout interior was dim, lit only by her 2 small windows, now blocked by the closed shutters she'd installed for exactly this purpose. She sat on her bed in the center of the room, as far from all walls as possible, and waited. The sound arrived before the wind. A roar that started as distant rumble and built rapidly into something beyond sound, something you felt in your bones more than heard, something that made rational thought difficult, because the primitive parts of brain screamed that this noise meant death, meant run, meant terror. The wind hit at 2:51 p.m. Clara would remember the time because she'd looked at her pocket watch exactly when the roar became unbearable, when the ground started shaking, when she understood this was it. This was the moment when she'd learn if her months of labor had built shelter or grave. The force was apocalyptic. The wind hit with pressure that made her ears pop violently, that made breathing difficult because air pressure was fluctuating wildly, that made the earth itself vibrate like someone was pounding on the ground with a massive hammer. Above her dugout, the tornado was passing directly over. Mile-wide column of rotating wind, moving at 300 miles per hour, carrying debris, destroying everything in its path, hitting her earth-covered roof with force that should have collapsed any structure. But 12 feet of earth and clay absorbed the impact like nothing. The dugout didn't move, didn't shift, didn't flex even slightly. The thick earth walls that everyone had mocked, the underground construction that everyone had called primitive, was completely immune to wind pressure that was exploding conventional houses built with modern lumber and proper techniques. Clara felt the storm through vibration in the earth, through the sustained roar that made her head ache, through pressure changes that made her nose bleed slightly from the violence of atmospheric fluctuation. But she felt it from absolute safety, from a position of complete protection, from a shelter that the tornado literally could not damage. The sound was continuous thunder, like 10 freight trains running over her head simultaneously, like the world was ending and she was somehow watching from safety, like every nightmare about violent weather made real, except she was surviving it. The storm lasted 8 minutes over her specific location, 8 minutes of sustained 300-mile-per-hour wind, passing directly above 12 feet of earth that didn't care about wind, didn't respond to pressure, just absorbed everything and protected the small room beneath. Clara sat on her bed in the dimness and waited for it to end, waited for the roar to decrease, waited to learn what had survived. She waited 10 minutes after the roar faded completely, making absolutely certain the tornado had passed, that she wasn't emerging into the trailing edge of the storm. Then she carefully unbarred her door, pushed it open against resistance. Debris had piled against it during the storm, and stepped out into transformed landscape. The destruction was total, was biblical, was beyond anything she'd imagined, even knowing tornadoes' power. The mile-wide path was visible from her elevated position, a scar across the prairie where everything had been erased. Trees that had stood for 50 years were gone, ripped from the ground and carried miles away. Prairie grass was stripped to bare earth, and the buildings, the houses, the careful constructions of settled civilization were simply gone, not damaged. Gone, exploded by pressure differential when tornado winds hit closed structures. The Henderson house, the largest, finest home in the settlement, 2 stories of proper construction with painted siding and real glass windows, was scattered across 200 yards. Clara could see the foundation from her position. Everything else was debris field. Pastor Morrison's house, which had stood directly in the tornado's path, was completely erased. Not a board remained standing. The foundation was empty. Every piece of the structure had been carried away. She later learned Morrison and his wife had survived in their root cellar, emerging to find their entire life scattered across Nebraska territory. 17 families had lost everything. Some houses were partially standing. Walls gone but floor intact, roof collapsed but foundation visible. Others were utterly obliterated, leaving only foundation stones and memories. The settlement that had existed at 2 p.m. no longer existed at 3:15 p.m. Clara's dugout stood absolutely untouched. The door was intact. The roof of sod showed no damage, actually looked better because the grass had been watered by the storm. The wooden front wall was undisturbed. The structure, built 12 feet underground, hadn't even noticed a mile-wide tornado passing directly over it. Families started arriving within the first hour, moving through shock and destruction toward the only shelter that had survived, desperate and homeless, and some bleeding from flying debris injuries. They came carrying children, carrying injured relatives, carrying nothing because they'd lost everything, moving toward the widow's burrow that everyone had mocked. The first family was the Hendersons, Robert, Sarah, and 3 children ages 6 to 12. Robert's face was bleeding from a cut above his eye. Sarah's dress was torn. The children were crying. They'd survived in their root cellar, emerged to find their house gone, stood in what used to be their living room, and realized they had nothing. "Mrs. Brennan," Robert said, standing at her dugout entrance with his family behind him, pride gone, mockery gone, desperation raw on his face. "Our house is destroyed. We need shelter. I know what I said about your dugout. I know I called it primitive. I called you foolish. I was wrong. Can we please come inside?" Clara stepped aside. "Come in! Everyone come in!" The Hendersons entered, 5 people crowding into Clara's 12 by 16-foot space. Then the Morrisons arrived, Pastor Morrison and his wife Martha, both in shock, both bleeding from minor cuts. Then the Thompson family, parents and 4 children. Then the Whitakers, then the Andersons. By dusk, 23 people were crowded into Clara's dugout. 23 refugees from tornado destruction, sitting on her floor, leaning against her earth walls, grateful for shelter they'd called unsuitable for civilized humans just days before. The space that was designed for 1 person now held 23. It was crowded, was uncomfortable, was cramped, but it was also safe, was dry, was intact. The earth walls that kept Clara cool in summer were now protecting 23 people from elements. The underground construction that everyone had mocked was now the only shelter in 5 miles. Clara shared her food, not much, but something. Made soup from dried beans and salt pork, stretched it to feed everyone at least partially, boiled water for drinking, organized sleeping positions so everyone had floor space, managed her sudden refugee camp with the organizational skills she'd developed teaching school. Robert Henderson, sitting on the packed earth floor of the dugout that had saved his family, eating bean soup from a tin cup Clara had provided, looked around at the solid clay walls, the undamaged timber ceiling, the complete structural integrity of underground construction, and understood everything he'd failed to understand before. "I called this primitive," he said to Clara, voice quiet but carrying in the crowded space. "Called you foolish for building underground. Said it wasn't proper housing for a civilized person. I was wrong about everything. This saved us. Your primitive burrow is the only structure that survived, the only home that worked when tested." "It's not primitive," Clara said, ladling soup for the next person. "It's adapted, built for the environment instead of against it. Tornadoes destroy houses that stand up because wind pressure has something to push against. Can't destroy houses that go down. The earth absorbs everything." By September, 6 families had started building dugout cabins on their homesteads, not exactly like Clara's, but incorporating her principles. Underground or semi-underground construction, earth walls, limited above-ground exposure, building with the landscape instead of trying to dominate it. The ridicule stopped, the mockery ended, the widow's burrow became Clara's dugout, and then just a practical dwelling adapted to Nebraska conditions. She lived in that dugout for 7 years, fulfilling her homestead requirement and then some. Eventually built a conventional house above ground, but kept the dugout as root cellar and tornado shelter, practical functions that acknowledged its real value. She remarried in 1878 to a teacher who'd arrived after the tornado, who'd seen the dugout and asked intelligent questions about its construction instead of making assumptions about her character. They had 3 children, built a larger house, prospered, but the original dugout still exists today, maintained by the Nebraska Historical Society. The earth walls are intact, the timber ceiling is solid. Modern structural engineers study it as an example of vernacular architecture adapted perfectly to regional conditions. The historical marker tells her story. Clara Brennan Dugout, built 1873. Example of adaptive frontier housing. Survived 1873 tornado that destroyed 17 conventional houses. Proved that primitive doesn't mean inferior. It doesn't mention the mockery, the petition, the social exclusion, the pastor's sermon about proper living, the absolute certainty everyone had that she was wrong. It just mentions survival and adaptation and the simple truth that sometimes the ridiculous solution is the only solution that works. But in Nebraska folklore, they tell a more complete story. About the young widow who dug herself a hole in the ground and survived a tornado while proper houses exploded around her, who built something everyone called primitive right up until it saved their lives. They tell that story to remind people, conformity isn't wisdom. Mockery isn't proof. Sometimes the person living in a hole in the ground understands engineering better than the person living in a fancy house. And sometimes, when people say you're living like an animal, what they mean is you're living smarter than they know how to understand.